Discovered my best friend's 4 kids are my husband's after 12 years of friendship, but karma was cruel. So here's my story. And honestly, it's one I never thought I'd have to share like this. I'm 29, a graphic designer by trade, and I run my own small design business. Work keeps me busy, and I like what I do. It's creative, challenging, and I get to work with some cool clients. But today, I'm not here to talk about work. I'm here because of my best friend, or who I thought was my best friend, Sarah. We met back in high school. I remember it so clearly because both of us were kind of the odd ones out, you know? While most people had their little cliques, Sarah and I were the type who didn't quite fit in anywhere. I guess you could call us the weird girls, but in the best way possible. We were both a bit awkward and had our own sense of style. Nothing wild, but not exactly what was cool at the time either. So we just clicked, almost instantly. It was one of those friendships where you don't even realize how quickly you become close. By the end of that year, she was already like a sister to me. From that point on, Sarah and I did practically everything together. And I mean everything. If you saw one of us, the other wasn't far behind. School projects, hanging out at the mall, sleepovers where we'd stay up all night talking, that was us. There was just this level of trust that's rare to find, and I think I valued that more than anything. I felt like I could tell her anything, and she'd never judge me. We knew each other's secrets, our insecurities, our plans, and we were there for each other through all the usual teenage drama. She was my partner in crime, my ride or die. Things kept going that way for years, even after we graduated. When I started my first job, Sarah was there cheering me on, and when she met her first serious boyfriend, I was there helping her pick out outfits, talking to her about what she wanted for her future, and whether he fit into it. I remember when she first told me she was in love. She was so giddy and happy, her whole face lit up. She swore he was the one. It was all the typical young love stuff, but she was dead set on him being her forever. And yeah, I thought it was fast, but who was I to judge? By 19, Sarah decided she was ready to marry him. She didn't want to wait, didn't care that everyone around her thought she was too young. She was completely sure about him, despite everyone, including me, warning her to slow down. But she had her mind set on it, so I did my best to support her even though I had doubts. That's just what you do for your best friend, right? You show up and stand by them, even when you're secretly hoping they'll reconsider. The wedding came and went, and for a while it seemed like she was actually happy. They were this picture-perfect couple, and even though I was still a bit skeptical, I started to believe maybe she'd found her fairy tale after all. But a year and a half later, it all came crashing down. I still remember the night she called me, absolutely broken. She was crying so hard I could barely make out what she was saying. When I finally understood, it turned out her perfect marriage had hit rock bottom. Her husband had been cheating on her, and their relationship was done. That was rough. I remember sitting with her through some really long nights, just trying to be there for her. She was so heartbroken, and it killed me to see her like that. We'd go for long drives where she'd cry and vent, and I'd just listen. I tried to keep her spirits up, but it wasn't easy. She was in such a dark place, and honestly, it was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to help a friend through. It was like watching someone fall apart and feeling totally helpless. But Sarah's the type of person who bounces back, even when it seems impossible. It took a while, but eventually, she started to piece herself back together. She got back into dating, though she was way more guarded this time around. Then, just as things seemed to settle, she met David. She was 23 by then and way more cautious than she'd been before. David was different, older, steady, the kind of guy who seemed reliable. They started seeing each other, and for the first time in ages, I saw her genuinely happy again. It was like this light was back in her eyes, and I thought, maybe this time it's real. After a year or so of dating, she decided to marry him. I was nervous, given how things had gone the first time, but she was certain about him, and I wanted to believe it could work. They had this small, beautiful wedding, and this time, it really did feel different. I guess I was so caught up in her happiness that I missed some of the signs. The crazy part is, it was at Sarah's wedding where I met my husband, Chris. He was a friend of David's, and we hit it off pretty quickly. I never would have guessed that we'd end up together, but one thing led to another, and soon, we were inseparable too. Looking back, it felt like we were creating this little friend family with me, Sarah, Chris, and David. We all became so close, doing holidays together, taking trips, just enjoying life. For a while, it felt like everything was falling into place. About 8 months after we started dating, Chris proposed. I'll admit it was fast, but everything felt so right. Planning my own wedding was a dream, especially with Sarah as my maid of honor. She was my rock through the whole process, just like I'd been for hers. It was honestly one of the best times in my life. And when Sarah found out she was pregnant shortly before my wedding, it was just this cherry on top. She was going to be a mom, and I was so happy for her. We postponed our wedding a bit so she could fit into her bridesmaid dress, and when we finally did get married, her son was already born. Having him there made everything feel so complete, like our little friend family was really solid. And while I'd made the decision not to have kids for personal reasons, I never felt like I was missing out. I loved Sarah's kids like my own, and Chris and I enjoyed being around them. It was the best of both worlds, honestly. For a long time, life just seemed perfect. We all had each other, and I never once doubted that I had the best friend anyone could ask for. Sarah was like a sister, and I thought we'd always be in each other's lives. Looking back now, though, maybe I should have seen that things weren't as perfect as I thought. Maybe there were little signs, moments that didn't sit right but were easy to ignore because we were all so close. But yeah, that was life with Sarah. She was more than just a friend, she was family. And I trusted her completely, without question. I guess sometimes the people we trust the most can surprise us in the worst ways. So, after Sarah's second wedding, things got pretty amazing for all of us. It was me, Chris, Sarah, and David, and it honestly felt like this perfect little crew. We did everything together, and I'm not exaggerating. Holidays, random weekends, even the occasional last-minute road trip if one of us got an itch to get away. And since Sarah and David had their first kid not long after my own wedding, it was like our friendship upgraded with a whole new layer. That kid was adorable, and I just loved him to bits. Honestly, the way our lives blended was more than I'd ever thought possible. When Sarah told me she was expecting her first kid, I was thrilled. It's not like we'd ever really talked about this exact moment, but knowing she was going to be a mom felt natural. Like it was the next step in this life we'd built together. Now, I'd already decided that having kids wasn't for me. A mix of medical stuff and just personal choice. But Chris and I were on the same page about it, so it worked out. Still, having Sarah's little boy around filled that kid part of my life without me actually being a parent. We'd all gather at each other's houses, and pretty soon having a toddler around became just normal life. It got to the point where I'd be talking to Sarah about dinner plans or our next weekend outing, and she'd be bouncing her baby on her hip while we chatted. Sometimes I'd even babysit while she and David had their date nights. It made me feel like I had all the perks of having kids without any of the actual responsibility. And Chris was great with him, too. He'd play games, make silly faces, the whole deal. Things just kept getting better from there. Sarah and David had more kids, one after the other, and I'm not going to lie, my heart kept getting a little fuller each time. By the time they had their fourth, I was practically Aunt Mom to the kids. They'd run up to me, hug me, call me auntie like I was part of the family. It felt special, like I had a place in their lives that went beyond just being Mom's friend. And to be honest, it made me feel like everything I'd ever done for Sarah was worth it. This wasn't just a friendship anymore. It was family. Chris and I, we made a solid team with them. He got along so well with David, and seeing them together was always a laugh. The guys would mess around, doing goofy stuff to entertain the kids, or having these ridiculous dad debates over the best way to set up a campfire or fix something around the house. I'd be watching them, laughing with Sarah, feeling like we'd won some kind of friendship lottery. We'd do double date nights, go on little family trips, take turns hosting holidays. Our lives were this giant overlap. By then, Sarah and I had this unspoken understanding, like we didn't even have to try to stay close. It was just a given. She was the one who'd seen me through everything, and I'd been there for all her ups and downs. I didn't even question how much I trusted her. There were times we'd talk late into the night about anything and everything. She'd vent about her rough day, or get all mushy about how much she loved her kids, and I'd be there, listening, laughing, agreeing. There was zero hesitation, zero doubt about where we stood. And yeah, I was busy with my own work. Running a wedding planning business, especially when you own the whole company, is no joke. The stress was real, and some days were just insane. But I knew I had this solid life waiting for me outside of work. I could go to Sarah's, let go of all the pressures of the day, and just be me. There's something so freeing about knowing you've got a friend who gets you like that. I mean, that's rare. Some people go their whole lives without a friendship like that, and here I was, living it. But it wasn't just friendship at this point. Chris and I had become so close to Sarah and David's kids that it was like we were this extended family, like I said. I didn't need to be a mom to feel that sense of family. Watching Chris playing with the kids or listening to them all laughing in the other room while Sarah and I had a glass of juice or a snack, those moments were everything. And every time one of those kids reached out for me or called me auntie, it just made everything feel right. They filled a part of my heart I hadn't even realized was empty. It got to a point where I didn't really question how much time we spent together. It was natural, like breathing. Need help watching the kids? I'm there. Planning a birthday party? I'd handle it. I was happy to do it, and Sarah seemed to appreciate it too. I loved those kids, and Chris did too. He'd talk about the little ones, like they were our own, telling me about the funny things they did or how they'd fallen asleep on him while watching a movie. He was so good with them, and seeing him in that role just made me love him even more. People would sometimes joke that I'd gone full auntie mode, and I'd laugh it off, but honestly, I didn't care. It felt good to be needed, to be loved by these little people who thought the world of me. And whenever I'd pick up Sarah's oldest from daycare, or help her youngest tie his shoes, it felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I wasn't just a friend anymore. I was part of the family, and they were a part of mine. When I think back to that time, everything really seemed perfect. No red flags, no tension, just this easy, comfortable life where everyone played their part. I never doubted it for a second. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our shared holidays, and the kids brought this extra joy that made everything feel richer. It was the kind of life that felt solid, like you could depend on it to stay exactly as it was. And if you'd told me then that any of this could fall apart, I would have laughed. Sarah was like my sister, and Chris was my best friend and partner. It was this steady, dependable thing, and I never saw a reason to question it. But looking back now, maybe that's where I went wrong. I trusted too easily, assumed things would always stay the same, and never once thought to look closer. But back then, I thought I was living my dream life. So yeah, we were this tight-knit group and my life was pretty great. I had a successful business, a husband I loved, and a best friend who felt more like family. And those kids? They were the icing on the cake. I couldn't have asked for anything better. Everything just seemed to click perfectly. And then, well, everything changed. So out of nowhere one day, I get a call from Sarah, and right away, I knew something was wrong because I could barely make out her words. She was crying so hard, like that ugly gasping cry where you're choking on your own tears. I'd never heard her like that, and it freaked me out. I dropped everything I was doing at work and rushed over to her place as fast as I could. When I got there, it was like walking into chaos. The house was a mess, stuff scattered everywhere, like someone had thrown things around in a rage. And then there was Sarah, just lying on the living room floor, still sobbing, her makeup smeared all over her face, looking like she'd hit rock bottom. It broke my heart to see her like that, and for a second I didn't even know what to say or do. So I just sat down on the floor next to her and waited for her to calm down. It took a while, but eventually she stopped crying enough to actually talk to me. I was bracing myself, thinking maybe something happened with one of the kids, or that she'd lost her job. I don't know. My mind went all over the place. But what she told me was something I never saw coming. She said David had left her. He'd packed his things, taken what he wanted, and left her and the kids just like that. I remember just sitting there staring at her because it didn't make any sense. Sarah and David were solid. At least that's what I thought. They weren't the couple that argued all the time or had any kind of major drama. If anything, they seemed like the most stable out of all of us. But according to Sarah, they'd been having these low-key arguments that kept getting worse over the past few months. Stuff about little things like money, work schedules, and him coming home late. Nothing huge, or at least that's what she thought. Then she told me he'd just come home one night, said he couldn't do it anymore, and walked out. Apparently, he said he'd send her the divorce papers soon, and that he'd make sure she and the kids were financially okay, but he was done. She showed me a short note he'd left, something about needing space and not being able to stay in a relationship that didn't make him happy anymore. It was like a generic breakup letter, and it made me mad. This was the guy who'd seemed like the ultimate family man, and he leaves her with nothing but a crappy little note? I was furious for her, but mostly I was just confused. I couldn't wrap my head around what had happened. Sarah and David had been together for years with 4 kids. And yeah, raising 4 kids isn't exactly easy, especially when they're close in age like theirs were, but still. Leaving like that? It just didn't seem like him. I decided to stay with Sarah and the kids for a few days. Chris was on a business trip, so it was perfect timing, and I knew she needed someone around. The kids were too young to understand what was going on, and I didn't want them to pick up on the chaos if I could help it. Every time one of them asked where Daddy was, I felt this mix of anger and sadness for them. Sarah would just say he was away for a bit and try to distract them, but I knew it was tearing her apart. I kept asking her if there was something specific that led to this, something she hadn't told me, but she kept shaking her head saying she didn't know. All she could say was that he'd started acting distant, picking these little fights over nothing and then sleeping in the guest room most nights. She thought it was just stress or work pressure, and that he'd snap out of it eventually, But instead, he just up and left. It was insane. I tried to think back to anything David might have said or done that seemed off, but nothing came to mind. He was always just David, you know? By the third day, my anger was boiling over. I told Sarah that David owed her more than just some dumb note. I wanted to know what happened, to get some kind of answer that made sense. I decided to reach out to Chris and ask him to talk to David about everything. Maybe he could get through to him, help him see sense, or at the very least, make him explain himself. When I called Chris and told him what happened, he sounded just as shocked as I was. He agreed to talk to David as soon as he got back from his trip to Chicago. I felt a bit of relief, like maybe this would give us some clarity. Chris and David had always been close, and if anyone could get an honest answer from him, it was Chris. In the meantime, I kept holding things down at Sarah's. She was barely functioning, and I tried my best to keep things together, cleaning up, making meals, putting the kids to bed. I even took her oldest to daycare so she could get a break. But in the back of my mind, I was still obsessing over why David would do this. I kept running through every memory I had of the two of them, every family gathering, every double date. Nothing added up. A few nights later, Sarah sat me down and told me she was pregnant. I was speechless. I'd been trying so hard to be her rock, to keep it together for her and the kids, but this just threw me off balance. She was already struggling with 4 kids, and now she had another one on the way, all while her husband was MIA. It was overwhelming. Sarah was a wreck, saying she didn't know how she was going to handle this, that maybe she'd even consider moving out of town to get a fresh start. But every time she talked like that, I just reassured her that she'd get through this, that I'd be there for her, and so would Chris. I kept hoping that once he talked to David, things would get better, or at least we'd get some answers. But here's the thing, the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I felt like David was running away from his responsibilities, from the family he'd helped create. And for what? Some vague, meaningless excuse that he wasn't happy? It didn't make any sense. I wanted to shake him, make him see what he was doing to his family, to Sarah, to those kids who adored him. As the days went on, I started to feel like this was more than just a rough patch or a little mistake on David's part. Something bigger was going on, but Sarah either didn't know or wasn't telling me. And the whole time I just kept thinking, how could he leave her? Leave all of them, especially now? It was hard to keep holding in the anger, the questions, but I knew I had to stay strong for Sarah. And that's where things were left. Chris was set to meet with David soon, and I was hanging on to the hope that this talk would finally give us some answers. Because honestly, none of it made any sense, and we were both desperate to understand what had actually gone wrong. After waiting for what felt like forever, Chris finally got back from his trip to Chicago, and I was on him immediately. I didn't even give him a chance to unpack. I told him he had to talk to David right away. I was holding on to hope that whatever David told Chris might help piece this whole thing together. Maybe it was a big misunderstanding or something he didn't want to share directly with Sarah. I mean, people keep secrets, right? But deep down, I had this gnawing feeling that it was more than just a bad patch in their marriage. So, Chris promised he'd reach out to David. I waited anxiously, half expecting some kind of magic fix to come out of that conversation. But when Chris finally came back to me after talking with him, his face was hard to read, and I could feel my stomach drop. He didn't have that everything's okay vibe I was hoping for. Instead, he just looked, I don't know, tense, frustrated even. Chris sat me down and told me he'd tried talking sense into David, but that David was set on the divorce. Chris said David seemed adamant that their marriage was over and didn't want to get into the details. According to Chris, all David said was that things had gone too far and that it wasn't fixable. I remember staring at Chris, waiting for him to say more, but that was it. No real explanation, nothing to make sense of what he'd done. But here's the thing. I couldn't just let it go. I couldn't accept that David was leaving Sarah with a vague excuse and no real answers. He owed her at least that much. So, after stewing on it for a while, I decided to go straight to the source. I figured if David wasn't going to open up to Chris, maybe he'd be honest with me. After all, I'd known him almost as long as I'd known Sarah, and he always seemed to respect me. Maybe he'd see that I was genuinely concerned for Sarah and the kids. I called him and asked if we could meet up for lunch. David seemed a bit surprised, but agreed. We met at a small diner near my work. I remember walking in, feeling a mix of nerves and anger. I didn't know what to expect, but I was prepared to push for answers if I had to. I couldn't stand the thought of Sarah being left in the dark, wondering why her life had just shattered. When David arrived, he looked different, kind of defeated, if that makes sense. I'd never seen him like that. He sat across from me and we made small talk for a minute, but I wasn't interested in beating around the bush, so I just laid it out there saying something like, David, I'm here because Sarah deserves to know what's going on. I'm here for her, and I need you to be straight with me. He looked away for a second, and I could tell he was struggling to find the words. He finally said, I'm sorry, I really am, but this marriage, it wasn't what it looked like. There were things Sarah wasn't honest about. I was baffled. What things? I asked, barely keeping my frustration in check. David took a deep breath, then told me something I never would have expected in a million years. He said that Sarah had been cheating on him. I almost laughed at first because it sounded so ridiculous. Sarah? The same woman who used to gush about how much she loved him? But David looked dead serious. He said he'd known for a while, that he'd even confronted her before about it, and they'd tried to move past it, but he just couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I kept pushing back, telling him maybe he was mistaken. Maybe he'd misunderstood something. But he shook his head and said he was absolutely certain. He said he'd even found proof. And then he dropped a bomb on me that turned my world upside down. David leaned in close and said, The kids, they're not mine. Those words hit me like a truck. I sat there stunned, my mind scrambling to process what he'd just said. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was out of his mind. I kept saying, David, there's no way. Sarah wouldn't do that to you. You're their father. But he just kept shaking his head, saying, No, I'm not. I did a DNA test. They're not mine. I can't even explain the rush of emotions that hit me at that moment. It was like anger, confusion, betrayal, all mixed together. I wanted to get up and leave, but at the same time, I needed answers. So I asked him, If they're not yours, then whose kids are they? David hesitated, like he didn't want to say it. And then he looked me dead in the eyes and said, They're Chris's. I remember my mouth just hanging open. For a second, I thought I hadn't heard him right. Chris? My Chris? The man who I'd trusted with everything? I kept telling myself this couldn't be happening. But David wasn't done. He went on to tell me how he'd confronted Sarah, how she'd broken down and admitted to everything. She'd been with Chris behind my back, and he'd been left to pick up the pieces, pretending to be the father of kids that weren't even his. At that point, I couldn't sit there anymore. I stood up, but David grabbed my arm gently and asked me to hear him out. He told me how he'd suspected it for a while, how he'd tried to ignore it, and how he finally decided to get DNA tests done on all the kids. None of them were his. He said he was devastated, but he'd stayed for the kids' sake. He'd even tried to forgive her. But then, when Sarah told him she was pregnant again, it was like the final straw. He couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't keep living a lie. I left that diner in a daze, barely remembering where I'd parked. My head was spinning, and I kept hearing David's words on repeat. They're Chris's kids. My mind just couldn't accept it. This was my husband we were talking about, my best friend, the people I trusted most. I kept telling myself that David had to be wrong, that he was making it up somehow, maybe trying to ruin their lives out of spite. But deep down I knew it made sense. All those little moments where Chris had been distant, the business trips that seemed too frequent, the times he seemed more invested in their family than ours. It was like all these pieces were falling into place, and the picture they were making was something I never wanted to see. By the time I got back to my car, I could barely hold back the tears. I didn't know who to talk to, didn't know where to turn. All I knew was that everything I thought I had, every bit of trust I'd ever put in these people, was shattered. I don't think I'll ever fully remember the drive home after meeting with David. My mind was all over the place, replaying every conversation, every little moment I'd had with Chris and Sarah. I couldn't believe it. No, I didn't want to believe it. Chris was my husband. Sarah was like my sister. The idea of them together, let alone with kids involved, it was too much. But deep down, I felt this sinking feeling that it was true. David had no reason to lie, and honestly, the details he shared were just too specific to ignore. When I got home, I barely took a second to breathe. I didn't want to calm down. I wanted answers. So I threw Chris's things into a pile, not caring where they landed, and waited. My mind was racing with everything I wanted to say, every question I had, and honestly, every insult that was bubbling up inside of me. When he finally walked through the door, he looked at me like he knew something was up. "What's going on?" he asked, probably noticing the mess I'd made in my anger. And that was it. I let it all out. I asked him if he'd been sleeping with Sarah, if he was the father of her kids. For a second, he just stood there, staring at me with that shocked expression, like he couldn't believe I'd figured it out. That reaction alone told me everything I needed to know. He didn't even try to deny it. He just looked at the floor like he was ashamed and finally muttered, "I'm sorry." That was all it took. The anger I'd been holding back exploded. I couldn't hold back the shouting, the anger, the betrayal. I asked him how long it had been going on, how he could do this to me, how he could betray me with her, my best friend of all people. Chris tried to explain, saying it had just happened and that he hadn't meant for things to go this far. He went on about how he felt trapped, how he and Sarah had gotten too close when I wasn't around. But none of it made any sense. Nothing he said justified the betrayal. There was nothing that could make this right. I remember asking him about the kids, if he really was their father. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut, like admitting it would make it all too real. And then he just nodded. That nod broke me. All those years I'd been part of those kids' lives, loving them, treating them like family, only to find out that they were his. With Sarah? It was like every memory I had of them was suddenly tainted. He tried to tell me that he still loved me, that he'd made a mistake. But at that point, I was done. I was numb, exhausted, hurt beyond anything I could describe. I told him to leave. I couldn't even look at him. The person I thought I'd loved for all those years suddenly felt like a stranger. Every time I tried to remember our good times, all I could see was him and Sarah sneaking around behind my back. Chris didn't argue. He packed a few things and left quietly, which somehow made it worse. It felt like he wasn't even fighting for us, like he'd already given up on what we had. Once he was gone, I just sat there in the silence, letting everything sink in. I'd lost my husband and my best friend all in one blow, and it felt like the walls were closing in on me. The next day, Sarah tried to reach out. I saw her name flash on my phone screen, and this wave of anger hit me so hard I almost smashed my phone. I couldn't even bring myself to pick up. I ignored every call, every message she sent. I wasn't ready to hear whatever excuses or apologies she had. In fact, I didn't even want to hear her voice. She'd been like family to me for so long, and now I couldn't stand the thought of her. But the calls didn't stop. She left voicemail after voicemail, crying, begging me to talk to her, saying she never wanted to hurt me. But those words felt empty. If she'd cared about not hurting me, she wouldn't have slept with my husband, wouldn't have had kids with him, and then kept me in the dark while I doted on those kids, thinking they were David's. How do you forgive something like that? How do you even begin to process that level of betrayal? I spent days just going through the motions, barely eating, barely sleeping. My mind kept replaying all the moments we'd spent together, every holiday, every celebration, every time she'd cried on my shoulder. How had I missed the signs? Had I been so blind? It felt like I'd been living in this fake reality they'd created, and now that it was shattered, I didn't know what was real anymore. Eventually, I blocked her number. I knew she wouldn't stop, and I wasn't ready to face her. My emotions were all over the place, and I didn't want to hear her voice, her explanations. What could she possibly say to make this better? There was nothing. Absolutely nothing. I started boxing up Chris's things. Every little item reminded me of what I'd lost. His clothes, his stupid coffee mug, even his side of the bed. It was like his presence was haunting me, lingering everywhere. So I packed up everything that was his and left it by the door. I couldn't even stand having his stuff in my space anymore. Through all of this, I kept wondering what my life looked like now. I'd spent years building something I thought was unbreakable. A marriage, a friendship, a family dynamic with these kids I loved like my own. And now it was all gone. Every bit of it. It felt like I was starting from scratch, but without any of the hope or excitement you usually get when starting over. This wasn't a fresh start. It was a mess I never asked for. The hardest part was knowing I'd been so close to the truth and missed it. All the times I'd sat with Sarah, talking about life, sharing our dreams, it was all a lie. She was lying to my face, keeping the truth hidden while I poured my heart into our friendship. It made me feel like a fool. I don't know how long I sat there that day, surrounded by empty spaces where Chris's things used to be, just staring into nothing. It felt like the end of something huge, something I'd never be able to get back. And the worst part was, there was no one I could turn to, no one who could really understand what I was going through. My two closest people were the ones who'd betrayed me, and I was left standing in the ruins, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do next. Last update. It's been a few months since everything blew up. Chris has been completely out of my life since that day I threw him out, and I haven't heard a word from him. I was done, completely done. I moved on, focusing on rebuilding my life, putting all my energy into my work and just trying to feel whole again. But then, out of nowhere, I got news about Sarah. She was sick. Really sick, apparently, with stage 4 cancer. It hit me like a punch to the gut, hearing that. I didn't even know how to react at first. Part of me didn't want to believe it. The same part that was still angry, that hadn't forgiven her and probably never would. But this was real. She was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do. A few weeks after hearing about her diagnosis, I got a message from Sarah herself. She was practically begging me for forgiveness, saying she was sorry for everything, that she didn't want to leave this world without making things right between us. She even told me she'd lost the baby she was carrying, and she was devastated. I could feel her desperation in her messages, but still, I couldn't bring myself to respond. I just couldn't. The wound was still too fresh, and every time I thought of her, all I could see was the betrayal. I'd trusted her with everything, and she'd taken that and crushed it. So I ignored her messages. I told myself that I needed to protect my own peace, that I had to look out for myself now, and for the next couple of months, that's exactly what I did. I tried to keep moving forward, focusing on the life I was trying to rebuild. Then, 2 months later, I got the news. Sarah had passed away. It hit me in a weird way. I didn't feel the anger or resentment I'd expected. Instead, it was this strange, heavy sadness, like a part of my life had really ended. Sarah had been my best friend for so long, and now she was just gone. And the worst part? I'd never responded to her messages. I'd never given her the closure she'd wanted, the forgiveness she'd begged for. But that wasn't the end of it. Sarah's family reached out to me shortly after, asking if I could take in her kids. I was shocked, but they explained that with David gone and Sarah's family unable to take them, they'd end up in foster care if no one stepped up. I thought about it long and hard. I mean, these were the same kids I'd loved and taken care of for years, the same kids I'd been there for all along. And as much as their existence was tied to everything that went wrong, they were innocent in all of this. They didn't deserve to lose everything. In the end, I made the choice. I took them in, officially. It's been a strange transition, but they call me Mama now, and I can feel a new kind of love for them, one that's different but just as strong. Every day I'm reminded of the hurt and betrayal, but at the same time, I know these kids need stability, love, and a home. And I can give them that. I've grown to see them as my family, as a part of my life that I'm now responsible for. So here I am, wondering if I made the right call. Reddit, am I the a-hole for not forgiving Sarah before she died? She hurt me deeply, in ways I still can't fully process, but part of me wonders if I should have put it aside for her sake. Or maybe I did the right thing by protecting my own heart and sanity. I'll never know if I made the best choice, but I did what I thought was right.